So welcome everyone to this webinar from the APA Division 40 Early Career Neuropsychology Committee. I'm Brian Van Patten of that committee, and I have the wonderful honor of introducing our guest speaker today. Dr. April Thames is a professor of psychiatry and chief psychologist of the Adult Psychology Division within the Department of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences at UCLA. She also directs the Social Neuroscience and Health Psychology Laboratory. For the past 20 years, her research program has been devoted to understanding cultural and social influences on health and behavior, and she's produced over 100 published papers and book chapters related to these topics. She was the first to demonstrate the effects of how societal stereotypes and discrimination influence cognitive testing performance. More recently, her work has been on the impact of how lifestyle factors influence differences in gene expression and brain aging, which has garnered attention across media outlets, including NBC California Live, NPR News, and the nation's health. Dr. Thames is passionate about promoting optimizing brain health in partnership with organizations such as the Alzheimer's Association, Department of Mental Health, and Department on Aging. And today, this evening, we are happy to hear you talk about early career research, advice, and paths in neuropsychology. So take it away, April.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. I hope that this talk is informative, and I really do encourage questions. I will try not to talk that long to allow room for discussion. So I will just share my screen since I do have a few slides. I'll just start. Thank you for introducing me, Dr. Van Patten. So I'm going to sort of move on into the presentation. As we all like to think, we like to think that there's this smooth pathway. This is the traditional pathway that a lot of students think about, that you do your graduate studies / internship, you get your PhD, you do some type of postdoctoral fellowship, and in clinical neuropsychology, usually that's 2 years. And then usually after that, it's thought that you're going to sort of land into the professional position. And we know that the truth is that the pathway really doesn't look as smooth. It's quite crooked for a lot of people, and there's a lot of back and forth. And I certainly have experienced that myself, which you'll see. So I'll talk a little bit about my personal journey. I started off, I did my graduate studies at Alliant International University, and I did my internship at Patton State Hospital, sort of specializing in clinical neuropsychology. And then after that, I went on and I did a postdoctoral fellowship, T32. It was under the neuropsychology of HIV/AIDS. And as part of the fellowship, I was also had a position within the Medical Psychology Assessment Center at UCLA, and I would see clinical neuropsych cases. So I was really doing a hybrid of research and clinical. And it's funny because when I went into graduate school, I really thought I wanted to be work in private practice, and that was really where my heart was set. And really throughout the journey, I sort of had a switch. So I decided I wanted to pursue actually a more research career. So because of that, I wasn't, I had to adjust a lot to what it would take. And while I was on fellowship, everyone told me, you have to write a National Institute of Health Career Development Award. That'll give you 5 more years of protected time so that you could build your research lab before you really can launch into independence. So I was at UCLA in my second year postdoc, and then I submitted my NIHK award, and it was not funded the first time, but it received what is called a fundable score, meaning that they didn't outright reject it, which would be you don't get a score at all. They actually gave me a decent score, but it wasn't going to hit the pay line. So I was fortunate enough that my advisor had an additional year of funding that I could stay on for fellowship, but this was my last chance. So if I did not get it the second time around, then I would have to quickly think about what it is that I was planning to do. So I went on the job market, and I actually was simultaneously rewriting my K while applying to a couple of assistant professor positions at colleges that were more, I would say, liberal arts colleges, because I needed to think, what am I going to do after fellowship? So fortunately, my K award did get funded the second time I submitted it. And with that, sort of automatically came a position at UCLA as an assistant professor. And that's really because I'm funding myself. So the Department of Psychiatry was very happy to take me on, since I was supporting basically my entire salary on my K award. But nevertheless, I started as assistant professor, received some startup money to begin my lab, and I worked on my K award, basically building my lab from 2012 to about 2017. I did go up for promotion at UCLA, and I received approval to get associate professor. And at the time, I was trying to apply for my first R award, which was a struggle. I applied a couple of times and was not having luck. Like, these applications were not even getting scored. And I started to have a panic attack, thinking, how am I going to fund myself moving forward if I don't get this R award? So I was back again as I was in postdoc, worried about funding, worried about a job. Here I was 5 years later in the same position because I was trying to get R funding. So fortunately, third time was a charm. I actually did receive funding, but then I had a pause where I thought, do I really want to continue on this academic medicine journey where I have to worry every 3 to 5 years about where my salary is going to come from? So at the time, there was a position that came out at University of Southern California. It was a Department of Psychology position, which is different than psychiatry because, as I'll explain later, in Department of Psychology positions, you are funded for 9 months. So you get what's called hard money. So if any of you have probably heard of hard money versus soft money just means that you're finding that money yourself, versus hard money is provided by the institution. So I decided to leave UCLA. I said, I really want something, I need stability. They were offering me, real tenure, which is, basically, most people look at it as the golden goose. That's what you're striving for in academia, is to get that tenure. So I went on to USC, and I was there for a few years. And then I realized how much I missed the clinical supervision, because in a Department of Psychology, there is a training clinic, but I wasn't doing clinical neuropsychology supervision at the level I was when I was at UCLA originally. So I missed that part. And then another opportunity came up at UCLA to take over a position that had been held by somebody for 45 years. And that was to direct the health and behavior internship track, and some other leadership roles sort of became available. And I threw my hat in the ring because I realized that I really missed being in a school of medicine and all that has to offer. And I decided to go back. And when I went back this time around, it's a little different when you come in as a professor with what's called a full-time equivalent, which is the university does provide some salary support, not the entire salary, but it's a lot more than it was previously. So that's been my journey. I've been back, as I was telling Ryan, just since 2021. And so often I do mentor early career folks, both MD and PhD, as well as those who have an MD/PhD on these various pathways, because I think the fundamentals of when you're trying to consider what is the right pathway for you, I sort of, this is very simplified, but I kind of see sort of three areas of divergence. One is that people go on in clinical neuropsych to an academic medical center, and within the academic medical center, you may take more of a research path or a clinical path, and I'll talk about that in a second. Or folks go on to either Research One institutions, like when I went to USC, I was in a department of psychology. It was considered Research One institution, clinical science model. Or people go on to a liberal arts college. So that's primarily dealing with teaching, etc. And then there's private practice or any sort of other consultation type work. And these are sort of the three areas that I think most people think about. Now, there are other pathways. I think there are alternative pathways. I've known people who have gone on and changed their entire career. And I'm totally in support of that. I think people really should do what is best for them ultimately. But there are things to consider. And usually when I'm advising people about what to think about, I usually think about these 5 sort of factors. And I don't think one is more important than the other because everybody is different, right? So for some people, it's going to be the function of the job that's going to drive their decision. Some people, it might be salary that, drives their decision. So I sort of have this in a circle because I think that each of these factors need to be thought about, but they will influence one another as somebody's thinking about their ultimate choice. So with academic medicine, as I mentioned, there's either sort of a predominant research path, and the typical course is that you are self-funded, primarily through grants and sometimes contracts as well. Some people get foundational grants from the government. They may get county contracts. Whatever the mechanism is, the expectation is that you're bringing in funding. And at the end of the day, all of these institutions, it comes down to the bottom line, which is the almighty dollar. And academic medicine, so the way that it works when you're applying for a grant is that universities get a certain percentage of what are called indirect cost. So academic medical centers, that when you're thinking about research, the institution is benefiting a lot from, so let's say you have $1 million grant and your university institution has 50% of what are called indirect costs. The university is going to get an additional $500,000 on top of that $1 million grant because that's their indirect costs. So it's very beneficial for the university to have researchers who are bringing in grant funding. And that is sort of the name of the game when it comes to that. There are clinical opportunities that may exist. For example, I'm at UCLA, I do supervision, but these are not usually well funded, if funded at all. This is usually kind of part of your departmental, I guess, team player responsibility, if you will. Now that I am directing certain programs, yes, I get some salary support for that, but it's not like it's astronomically high by any means. So publications in the research path are what I like to call the currency for promotion as well as grants. So I sit on academic promotion committees, and I've done a lot of reviews for tenure, and I can tell you that most people are looking at grants and publications in the dossier or the academic file. So that's expected. Service, when you get, usually when you're an assistant professor, you're protected with respect to service time, But once you get tenure, or you move on to associate, then you're expected to do service. And unfortunately, it's not heavily considered at the time of promotion. They will ask for people who are moving on from, say, associate to full professor, whether or not they're doing service or have done service. But I have seen dossiers move through the system. If the person has enough grants and publications, then it's no one's going to hold somebody back because they didn't do enough service. So just something to think about. I always tell people, think about where you're spending your time, because a lot of people will want you to join committees and do a lot of service. But at the end of the day, what is actually going to get you promoted is where earlier on in your career you want to spend your time. In the research academic medicine sort of arena, what's considered teaching is very flexible. So for example, when I'm asked to provide documentation of my teaching, I may have given a lecture within a seminar, or a professor in the Department of Psychology may have me come over and give a lecture. That counts as teaching. So does clinical supervision. So those things count as teaching in this particular domain, because the thought is that you don't have a lot of time to teach a formal class, although some people do because they enjoy it. But again, it's a little bit of an extra above and beyond step. Schedule can be very flexible if you're well-funded. I have colleagues who are obviously more senior, but some of them spend 6 months out of the year in another country, and they're still, because their research labs are sort of well-oiled machines operating on their own. Nobody's asking you if you're bringing in enough money. Nobody's going to expect you to be anywhere, essentially. So the more funding you bring in, the less people are on your back and the less things that you have to do to sort of support your salary aside from grant funding. Now, the clinical path within academic medical schools some consist of teaching hospitals, UCLA being an example of one, and some do not. So there might be within academic medicine and also VAs. So I don't want to exclude, I'm not talking specifically about VAs because I don't work in a VA, so I feel like I probably wouldn't do it justice. But I do think that there are some similarities in that there are training clinics, obviously, within VAs. And so as a clinical neuropsychologist, you will be involved with the training program. And that will give you the opportunity to work with interns, externs, postdoctoral fellows. So if you really like that kind of role of being a supervisor, then the clinical path might be a good fit. Clinical earnings, however, are generated at a lower scale than, say, in private practice. And that's because in a lot of these settings, we're taking insurance. And at least, and I'll speak for California, many of the people who go into private practice, some will decide as neuropsychologists that they're not going to take insurance, or they're going to provide people what's called a super bill, which is a summary of services so that they can then go and try to get the money reimbursed from their insurance. So the difference with that is obviously the reimbursement rate for a neuropsychological assessment, and this is going to vary state by state. So, and based on insurance, but on average, being in an academic medical setting, functioning clinically, you will receive a base salary. It's expected that you're seeing a certain number of cases because that is what's holding your clinical salary. And to really reach that threshold, you have to see a lot of patients because, unfortunately, it's just sometimes it's not as lucrative. But nevertheless, people who are working in these settings will have access, particularly at teaching hospitals, to externs, interns, postdocs who do the testing So a majority of their time is mostly doing the clinical interview and supervising. So there's kind of a tiered approach, if you will, to seeing patients versus, and I'll talk about a little bit with private practice, that may not be the case. There's less expectation of service usually for those who are clinical, or what we call at UCLA the health sciences track. But there's some, some expectation that they're doing something, but it's not as heavily emphasized as it would be for people who are on, say, the tenure track. And that's the same that would go at a Research One institution as well, that service becomes more of an expectation for those who are on tenured tracks or tenured. Publications are not as heavily emphasized in promotion. It's sort of one of those things where if you have it, great. If you don't, that's okay, as long as you're demonstrating clinical excellence, if you will. So if you've developed a program, if you've contributed to the expansion of a program, those are aspects that would warrant promotion within a clinical series. Schedule is not as flexible because you're working within the confines of clinic hours. So for many of my clinical colleagues that are primarily clinical, they don't have as much flexibility as I do for, in terms of being able to come and go when I please. Okay. I just want to make sure, any questions up to this point about academic medicine and academic medical centers?
I have a bunch that
Okay.
that writing down in some notes here. I think I'm happy to hold them to the end.
Okay. I mean, that's fine. Yeah, I just didn't, yeah, we could definitely, there'll be enough time for questions. I just didn't know if anyone had anything burning. So research-oriented institutions versus liberal arts colleges. With Research One institutions, such as USC, UCLA, Stanford, I'm naming the California ones, I'm obviously biased, but nevertheless, across the board, the expectation is still that you're bringing in grant funding and you're teaching. And the teaching load is more than academic medical centers, because keep in mind, when you're at a Research One institution or a liberal arts college, they're funding 9 months of your salary. And so tuition from undergrads primarily, and that's part of your salary is the tuition. So that's where the teaching comes in. But you're still also expected to bring in research grants because, again, as I mentioned, those indirect costs are great for the university. So teaching loads can be negotiated depending on how much funding you're bringing in. So some people you might hear buy out their time or have a reduced load. Usually at R1 institutions, if you're doing administrative positions such as being director of clinical training or your department chair, or you're working in the dean's office, you can reduce your teaching load expectation. Or if you have a lot of grant funding and you can fund yourself over the summer, then you can negotiate that. Mentoring graduate students is a major focus. And I don't think I realized that as much when I got to USC about how intense it is. I mean, the graduate education within the clinical psychology department is, it's a huge emphasis among the faculty. So if you don't like mentoring graduate students, then you probably don't want to be in a department or college department out at a Research One university. Administrative positions within the department are usually not well compensated. So at some point, every faculty member, particularly in departments of psychology, will be expected to take on a role such as director of clinical training or associate director of something, maybe even department chair. And while those sound amazing, the title, it's a lot of work and the time is not as well compensated. And many of my colleagues have shared that sentiment that it's a lot of work for what you get. Now, some people get an intrinsic value out of being in those roles. So if that's the case, that's great. But just so you know, it will be expected at some point. At R1 institutions, you are, quote, on the clock for tenure and promotion. So usually you have what's called a 2-year, like a mini review, then you have like a 4-year review, and you're expected at that point to kind of be on the track for getting promoted to associate professor. You usually have mentors who are helping you along the way. But if for some reason it doesn't happen, then that's the stage where assistant professors, might end up leaving because they're just not going to get promoted to associate. And that's a huge jump and a huge stressful hurdle. So the first 5 to 7 years of being an assistant professor, you are working your butt off because it's all about getting the tenure. At liberal arts institutions, the expectations are more so with teaching and mentoring. So you will have a very large teaching load because there's less emphasis on grant funding. And sometimes grant funding can even be discouraged if it's somehow going to detract from teaching or administrative responsibilities. So just to keep that in mind. Okay, so with private practice, compensation is usually higher than in academic medicine in general. Now, we all know that one person who might, that might not be the case, but in general, I'm speaking, business may take 3 to 5 years before you begin to see real profit. So obviously with a private practice, if you're going out on your own or even going in with a partner, you have to purchase rental space, you have to purchase test materials. So a lot of the upfront costs, you may not see the benefits of that for a while because it takes time for people to know who you are, to know your practice, and for you to develop some type of niche, because in certain areas, it's saturated with neuropsychologists. So you have to think a little bit about how to market yourself. And that to me is a skill that I personally do not have. I am not good at self-advertisement nor business marketing. So I would personally have to hire somebody to do that for me because it's just not a natural thing. So these are the expenses that sometimes people are putting into private practice. It can be lonely if you're on your own. If it's a one-man shop, you don't have that camaraderie of colleagues that you might in other types of settings. One needs to stay abreast of the latest clinical practices. So knowing what's happening within neuropsychology, it's really important to keep up with the times, if you will. Benefits are flexible personal schedule. You are the one scheduling your patients. So if you want to take a month off, you just don't schedule patients for that month. Health benefits and retirement plans must be fully funded by you. So they're really, that I'm not aware of any health benefits that are being supplemented by some other entity like it would be if you're in a setting such as the VA or academic medicine. We usually have pretty good retirement and benefit plan. For people who are in private practice, they have to come up with something on their own. Okay, so I've talked about the functions of sort of these various jobs. Now, the next thing is personal factors. So where do you want to see yourself settling for the next 5 to 10 years? I always ask that question of postdoctoral fellows who are coming to me and saying, what should I do? Which path should I pursue? I usually say, well, where do you want to live? Do you want to own your own home someday? These are factors. How important is diversity within the town, city, state that you live in? Do you want to be close to immediate family and friends? Spousal considerations, children, student loan or personal debts. So for some people, again, everything's going to weigh more heavily for certain people, more so for certain people than others. For me personally, I needed to be close to my mom. I didn't want to move away. So that was really important. I have a small family. So for me, that was probably number one. Number two was I wanted to eventually be able to own my own house. And that was, and make enough money to do that. So that was important. Salary. I feel like when I was earlier in my career, this was the hush hush. Nobody ever talked about salary. And even if you ask about it, you were looked at like horns just grew out of your head. And how dare you ask about salary? You should just love what you do and never ask. I give the opposite advice. You should know salary rates at various institutions. People may not want to tell you what they're making personally, but ask for a range. So I always would ask people, well, you don't have to tell me what you're making, but what would you say the range is for someone first starting out? Ask about merit increases. So how often does this happen? What's the process? Who decides whether or not you get an increase in salary? Be realistic of salary expectations. And I just put this here. You know, it's like, it's extremely rare. Like, I haven't seen a first year PhD assistant professor make over $150,000. Usually the range is between 65 and 100,000, depending on the area. And I might be misquoting, you know, it may be different now, but this is sort of what I saw when I was out on the job market. Another important thing to think about salary is, do you want it to be self-funded? Which in academic medical schools, if you're bringing in a lot of funding, you can negotiate a higher salary with your chair, but you have to be careful because you have to be pretty darn sure that if you ask for a salary increase, that you will continually receive that level of funding, because now you're responsible for it. So sometimes people who I know maybe keep their salaries a little bit on the lower end because it's safer in the event that maybe they don't have a bunch of grant funding coming in. So these are all things to kind of think about. Self-funding, no matter if you're in academic medicine or private practice, it's always riskier, but usually associated with more autonomy. And with respect to longevity, I like to think about, you know, is this something you see yourself doing for a long time? Or is this a career path that you perceive as a stepping stone into something else? You want to ask, or at least examine, how long do people tend to stay in the career? Is there a high turnaround rate, burnout? And what does retirement look like for most people? So often at these Research One institutions and even academic medical centers, people just don't retire. They just stick around. And so you might, and I remember wondering why. I thought I would love to just run out the door as soon as I could for retirement, but you know, people still get their salaries and they basically, they're like on call and don't have to do anything. And so that's why a lot of these people stick around and don't retire. So, or they retire, but it's like a soft retirement, like they're still around. So these are just things to ask, I think, for future. Finally, personal fulfillment. Do you get an intrinsic reward from this career path is something to ask. So I had to be real with myself and think about what the things that I don't like to do and the things that I like to do. Now, I don't get to do everything that I like to do. Certainly there are things in my career that I have to do that I don't prefer, but I look at the ratio. So I try to keep it to, I'm doing most of the things I like and sprinkled in with some things that I don't like. Because if it's the opposite, if it becomes the other way around, you will burn out quickly. Another question is, do people in this path feel supported? It's obviously going to vary by setting, etc. But in general, do people feel supported? If not, you will burn out quickly. Does the career give you a sense of purpose? Do you feel like you're actually doing something, making change, or whatever it is that is that intrinsic motivation? If not, you will burn out quickly. And finally, does the career give you adequate compensation for your time? If not, you will burn out quickly. So the moral of the story is that there has to be something driving our career choice, our path. And if we're on that path and we don't like that path, or we think we want something else, it's okay to switch over. I've done it. You switch over, you switch back, you figure it out. But I've had to constantly face these questions because I would feel myself burn out. And I'm thinking, why am I burning out? And usually it's because I'm not fully satisfied with something that it is that I'm doing. So the burning question that I usually get is, what is your career like in terms of breakdown of time? So I thought I would just provide that and give you an example of what it's like for me. I would say approximately, and this is not an exact percentage, but I would say about half the time I'm engaged with quote research, which that does not mean that I get the fun of analyzing data and thinking of new research questions like I used to do in postdoc. I love doing that. I miss that, but those days are long gone. So my research really involves trying to get more money for my lab, hiring staff, dealing with administrative tasks like, buying a freezer for our blood samples. Like, what if the freezer breaks down? Like every day I deal more with little nitty gritty things around my lab that are not fun. They're not there. But it's part of running a lab. I meet regularly with my research staff to make sure everything is going okay. If we have a participant issue, I have to be able to address that. So that 50% time, plus writing grants and trying to get publications, out the door, that's my quote research time. My clinical time is I supervise 3 to 4 neuropsychological assessment cases a month in the clinic. I direct the consultation liaison service for inpatient, for psychology. So for adult psychology. So I am supervising 6 to 7 inpatient consultations. So very brief intervention, psychotherapy. So I don't just do neuropsychology, but it's a lot of supervision. And then I'm a preceptor for interns to kind of help them more with professional development. So that's my clinical time that I would say, clinical/teaching, because of course you're always asked to give a lecture for seminars. So that's not even in this percentage breakdown. And then I spend a lot more time in service than I should. I'm on 9 different committees throughout the institution, and they meet on average once a week, is some type of long meeting. And that I would say is probably where I need to work on, is getting off of so many service responsibilities. But that's where it stands now. My words of wisdom, sort of concluding here, would be that if you go off a traditional path, or what you think your path is supposed to be, it's not failure. I actually look at it as dynamic growth. You should move around a little bit throughout your career, because if you're not, then people run the risk of becoming stagnant. And what you think you want to do now is probably going to change in 15 to 20 years. What I wanted to do initially coming out of postdoc is not exactly what I'm doing now. I never thought I would direct a health and behavior consultation liaison program for inpatient. Like, I never thought that I would like it or do it, and I'm doing it, and I actually like it a lot. And I'm learning as I go. So it's helping me with that stagnation that I was having. Embrace the experience of the journey rather than the end point. I think everybody kind of knows this, but if I look back, I always thought, oh, once I get promoted to associate, it's going to be like utopia. The sky's going to open and the clouds are going to, you know, sun shining. It's going to be wonderful. And what I actually became really, I don't know what the word, I wouldn't say depressed, but I was kind of like, is this it? Like, it was such a delayed gratification and so much hard work. Like, I was happy when I got the tenure, but then I thought, is this all it is? And I remember having that moment because you're so fighting to get to that point. And really what the joy is the journey along the way. So I would encourage that. And finally, you will get tired no matter what you do of your job one day. So make sure your life is not your job and to engage in things besides that. That tends to be how people survive for the most part. So with that, I'll say thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thames, for that talk. That was wonderful. It's clear that you mentor early career people based on your talk. That comes out a lot of the breadth of coverage, clinical and research, personal and professional factors, and the fact that you have experience in Department of Psychology and School of Medicine, Department of Psychiatry is great. So as Dr. Thames mentioned, happy to take questions. Callie, Dr. Dunn, did you have your hand up?
Nope, that was not me, but it looks like Alex had a question in the chat.
Yep. So Alex Tan in the chat. Alex, you're welcome to ask this, or I can read it to the group.
Oh, I can read. Yeah, sure. So I'm in a clinically oriented job in a hospital setting, but I do have protected time and institutional support to PI a research study. So I'm just wondering about your recommendations for kind of how to make best use of your time in that kind of situation. Like any specific types of grant funding that would be good to pursue in that kind of situation, or other immediate goals that would be important to kind of set you up for long-term success, but knowing that it's always going to be a minority of your time.
Right. I think that's a good question. So I assume that you like being in a clinically oriented. Is that where you want to stay, or are you looking to eventually shift to more of a research?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, no, the situation would stay the same.
Okay. So I think it's good in terms of specific types of grants to pursue. That largely depends on the type of research that you're doing. So I would look at, if you're doing outcomes-based research, for example, looking at outcomes, there's like PCORI, and I think it's the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, something. So a lot of people who do like health services outcomes research kind of go to that mechanism. If you're doing health related issues, then NIH, has the 27 institutes that we're all familiar with. But I think just any foundational grants, I would say, are great, but there's definitely a lot of accountability depending on the foundation. So sometimes you might find yourself with, having to do all these progress updates. I mean, you have to do it for every grant. You have to show like what you've been doing. But I find with the foundational grants, sometimes it's a lot of paperwork. And this may just be my experience, but for the amount of money you get. So, you're in a situation where you don't really need to be the PI, which is actually good because you can be flexible with various grants that you're on and dabble in areas that you may not, because I feel like if you're trying to be the PI, let me back up and say, you have to demonstrate a track record of like doing that work. So sometimes being a principal investigator, when you're going for those grants, you're sort of pigeon-held to what people know that you can do. If you're a co-I, then you get to be on a grant where you have some expertise, but you don't have to have demonstrated such an extensive track record in the main area. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. I think, and sorry if others have questions, please feel free. But I think the main consideration um, is it worth pursue, like if I'm in an institution that is already supporting my research time, and is supporting the study, is it worth kind of using time to pursue grant funding? Or it sounds like you might be expressing that in some cases, like pursuing grant funding just to pursue grant funding might not actually be worth the time given the level of expectation and accountability associated with it.
Right. Like, I mean, obviously, like bringing in money, everyone loves. So your department institution is going to love you the more dollars you bring in, because that's what it's all about. But I would say in your situation is if that is going to be continued protected research time, like it's not just time limited that you're getting that institutional support, then I might dabble. Like if it were me, I might dabble in areas that research areas that I have an interest in, but I don't necessarily need to be the PI, because I mean that may be, that's just my opinion of what I would do. If you were telling me, I don't know how long this institution will support my protected research time, and I always want some protected time, then I would say get your own funding, because then you do have the most sort of power over that time that's spent, and you can be more, you have more to negotiate with the institution. But it doesn't sound like right now you're in that case. So I might just have fun with it, have fun with the research protected time, pursue things that you like to research and write papers on.
Excellent. So, as I mentioned, anyone feel free to raise your hand or type it in the chat if, oh, we got a hand raised. Please.
Hello, Dr. Thames.
Hi.
Thank you for the talk. I actually had a question about R2 institutes. Is that a place neuropsychologists could be working at? Do you know people who work at those institutes? What would it look like?
Oh, I don't know that I've heard the term R2. Are you referring to more like teaching colleges or like state? Okay. Yes, they do. I mean, so here's the tricky thing about those institutions. If you want to do clinical work, then you might not find the room to do that, because you're going to be doing more teaching. But you may be able to negotiate teaching a course in clinical neuropsych, or for undergrads, it would be like psychobio would be the closest thing. But you know, oftentimes with more teaching, or what I call liberal arts or R2 institutions, is that there's a curriculum that they want their students to make sure that they go through. And so clinical neuropsychologists are often asked to teach assessment, or some sort of, for undergrad, like abnormal behavior or psychobio. So yes, clinical neuropsychologists I've seen go into those settings, but usually in terms of any clinical work, that you have to do that on the side. So they'll have like their own practice, and some people make that work. They'll have like their teaching job that provides that hard money support, and then they kind of dabble in private practice on the side.
As you mentioned earlier, in addition to publications, grant writing is the currency that early career researchers think about. So I know we only have a few minutes here, and there are so many questions about grant writing that people tend to have, but I wonder if you just have any general advice for early career folks who are balancing, juggling, clinical work, life transitions, and also trying to write a first grant or early grant. They don't have a lot of experience with it. There are books out there. There are grant writing committees. You can get mentorship. You can sit on a committee where you yourself are reviewing grants to learn about how it works, but you only have so much time.
Right.
What do you say when you're mentoring the early career folks on this issue?
I mean, it would be all of that, right? So I would say that in terms of where to carve out the time, I mean, it's hard. I like to see grants that have been successfully funded personally. Like and I don't know because everywhere is different, but some places have like a bank of grants where people like you could see what it looks like. Because for me, grants are like everything. So when my clinical time starts to creep up, it's hard, right? Because when you have a lot of like there's patient demands and it requires like immediate response. So you almost have to like forcefully block out time from the clinic work if you're able to do that, because to write a successful grant requires so much. Like I tell people, like when you're first starting out, like give yourself a good solid 6 to 8 months to prepare. That means like meeting with the team members, making sure like it's not even about writing it at that point. It's just about developing the collaborations and all the stuff that comes with it. So I don't know, Ryan, if I'm answering your question the way, there's all these resources out there, as you mentioned, about how to write a good grant. But I think the issue is people don't give themselves enough time. They see a deadline and I've been guilty of this. It's only like 3 months away and I think I can spin it together and it never works. It never works. Not for me anyways. It works maybe if you've been doing it successfully for years and years and years, but to pull off a strong grant proposal requires a lot of time. So I would say if you have a lot of clinical duties, then what may take someone 6 to 8 months to get off the plate may take you about a year. So plan for it.
Great advice.
I see a question in the chat.
Yep, please.
Should I read it?
Yeah, I'll go ahead.
It's just, could neuropsychologists be involved in policy making at the WHO or Congress? Not sure if this is discouraged or not. Interesting. Yes, there are people that I know who are involved with the Alzheimer's Association policy. For example, Dr. Maria Diaz-Santos, who's at UCLA, specifically went up with the Alzheimer's Association to Washington and did some advocacy for policy. So there's very few that are doing that kind of work. I think it's fascinating work. I think it's more of what we need to do. It's just traditionally that's not where neuropsychology has landed, but it certainly doesn't mean that you wouldn't be able to get involved. What's going to happen anytime you try to pursue something that's not traditional or the way that things are usually done is that you're going to be met with some initial roadblocks and trying to convince people, why is it important? You may not be able to have it built into your time, so it's going to take extra time. So these are just all things to consider. But in terms of now, with the importance of advocacy, I think more neuropsychologists are waking up to, we need to be involved with that as well. And cool, there's another webinar on it. So, okay, yes, Mark.
Hi, I'm still early in the early career neuropsych phase where I'm still thinking of making the leap from postdoc to a faculty position. Like you, I'm planning to take 3 years just because the research side of things is a little intense and different than the clinical track. But I was just wondering if you had any advice about how to look for positions that allow for research and also, some level of clinical work at an AMC, academic medical center, because it seems to me that those positions either are posted like in like a hush hush sort of way. It's sort of like it's not really well advertised, and whether it's even something that I should be looking for on like LinkedIn or something like that. Just any thoughts you had about applying to those positions or finding them even?
Yeah, I mean, I actually do think LinkedIn, I've seen positions come up, but I probably would just start asking around at people, because you'd be surprised who people know in certain spaces. Neuropsychology is very small world. And so like if you're interested, so there's a couple things you could do. One is that you try to give a talk somewhere, like to get invited. That's a lot of people do this when they're kind of shopping around institutions, is that, you know, you could reach out, you know, there, a lot of places are always looking for someone to come give a talk or do grand rounds or something. So if you have a real interesting area to pitch, then maybe just say, hey, you know, like, I'm, you know, really interested in, you know, potentially giving a talk and, you know, want to introduce myself. And that might be one avenue, just so that people start to get to know your work, and then getting the invites. So that allows you kind of the inside scoop. Asking other people if they know about positions that might be opening at particular institutions that you're interested in. That's another, it's really word of mouth. And like you said, by the time the advertisement comes out, it's either people have already told people about the position. Like, it's like rare that at the assistant level, it's more common, but associate and full, it's usually like a little birdie in the air. You kind of hear about it. And so the more you can ask people and let them know that that's what you're looking for, then they could keep an eye out for you if they hear something.
Thank you. That's super helpful.
We are approaching the top of the hour here. I think we've packed in almost as much as one could about early career research in an hour. Dr. Thames, this has been wonderful. Thank you. And
Oh, good.
yeah, thanks everyone for the questions and attention. Any last minute, 2-minute questions before we wrap up? Anybody? I think we all know a lot more about research and neuropsychology. Oh, we have one more. Nope. We all know more than we did an hour ago. So thanks again, Dr. Thames and everyone.
Well, thank you so much.
All right. Have a good night, everyone.
All right, you too. Bye-bye.